Thank you for joining our webinar, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn, Posing Good Questions to Promote Student Inquiry. We would like to share a few housekeeping items before we begin. All of your phones are muted for the duration of the call. You can ask a question or post a comment in the chat window. Take a look for the chat window now and feel free to introduce yourself and say where you're from in the chat. This webinar will be recorded and sent to all registrants. Plus, it will be posted on the AASA website. AASA is pleased to bring you this webinar with Solution Tree. Solution Tree has worked since 1998 to transform education worldwide by empowering educators to raise student achievement. With close to 50,000 educators attending professional learning events, Solution Tree helps teachers and administrators confront essential challenges. It is now my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Eric M. Francis. Eric Francis is an international author, educator, and presenter. He provides professional development on how to plan and provide engaging teaching and learning experiences that are academically rigorous, socially and emotionally supportive, standards-based, and student responsive. Take it away, Eric.
Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. Thank you for everyone for joining me on this exciting journey of how to teach and learn with an inquiring mind. Again, reintroduce myself. My name is Eric Francis. I'm an author, educator, and presenter. I've been an educator for over 30 years, been a classroom teacher, a site administrator, and worked at a state education agency out here in Arizona. And in 2012, I decided to break out on my own and start my own professional development company called Maverick, Maverik Education. I'm also the author of 3 books, 2 that I'm proud to say has been published with Solution Tree, my book, Deconstructing Depth of Knowledge, and also the book that I'll be presenting on today, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn, Posing Good Questions to Promote Student Inquiry. Now, before we get started, I'd like to ask you a question. I'd like you to choose one of these questions to address from each column. What I'd like you to do is I'd like you to either write on an index card, or if you're at your computer right now, type into a Word document. What is essential to learn about a subject or skill students must learn? It could be a subject that you are familiar with. Maybe it's a subject that you even taught when you were a classroom teacher. So just write down a declarative statement that says what is essential to learn about a subject or skill students must learn. Or you can choose what is important to understand about a subject or skill you teach or taught. So it may not be the most essential thing, but it's important to understand to help the student achieve that essential standard. Or what's interesting or what's nice to know about a text or topic you teach or taught. So right now, what I'd like you to do is I just would like you to just write a declarative sentence, like to pretend that you were lecturing to your students, you were sharing information to them. Write a declarative sentence that is something that's essential to learn, important to understand, or nice to know about a subject or text or topic or technique or skill that you teach or taught when you were a classroom teacher. In the other column, what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go to either your state's academic standards or your regions or even your nation if we're doing this internationally. And what I'd like you to do is pick what is an academic standard from your location students must achieve. Just pick one standard. It could be an essential standard, maybe a standard you prioritized, or one it's important to understand, or one it's nice to know. Just go and find an academic standard from your location. And what I'd like you to do is to copy and paste it in that Word document, or just have it there because we're going to go revisit that later. If you don't want to use a standard, I want you to write down a learning target or a learning objective that your students must achieve. So just any learning target, anything I can, we will be able to, we will, just write down a learning target. Now, this is how you teach and learn with an inquiring mind. You start with a question. You start with a question to stimulate thinking. You start with a question to pique curiosity, imagination, interest, and wonder, which is what I hope I've done with you, because you're probably, hopefully wondering right now, well, why is he making me do this? And that's what captures your attention and also gets you engaged in a lesson. So again, just pick one of these questions from each column to address, and we'll come back to them later in the presentation. What I'd also like to do is share with you my objectives and your outcomes. So I'd like you to know what my objectives are. These are basically my objectives for presenting, my instructional objectives if I was teaching a classroom. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to clarify how a good question promotes student engagement and learning through inquiry and by questioning. That's the first thing I'm going to address. I'm also going to establish how the rigor of a good question depends upon the response students must provide. This will help us understand what does it mean to ask a question that is academically rigorous. I'm also going to illustrate and explain ways to teach and learn with an inquiring mind through inquiry and by questioning with good questions. And then what if I told you I just actually have been doing that right now, because this is how you teach and learn with an inquiring mind. You start with a question and then you see where the lesson goes. Your outcomes for today is this. You're going to learn how to teach and learn through inquiry and by questioning with good questions. You're going to learn how to rephrase academic standards and learning targets into good questions that will promote student engagement and inquiry. And you're also going to learn how to craft and create good questions in your own unique way and with artificial intelligence. Here's the question I always ask. If the students are going to go get their answers from AI, why don't we use AI to come up with some good questions? That's the thing. We shouldn't fear the technology, but AI is a stimulus, not a source. Right now, what I'd like you to do is this. I would like you to enter into the chat box there. What is something you would like me to address? So you've seen my objectives and you realize what your outcomes are. But what is something you specifically would like me to address? In a way, you're telling me, why are you here? Basically, what is it that you're here? Why do you want to learn this? So basically, what I'd like you to do is enter into the chat, please. What is something you would like me to address? And I will read it as I turn stuff over to you. The other thing I'd like you to enter into the chat and address is, what would you like to take away from this learning? So basically, what would you like to take away from this training? Having being here, you'll be with you here for the next hour. Please enter into the chat. What would you like me to address? And also, what would you like to take away from this training? This is something I basically, during the pandemic, when we were all virtual and all online, this is how I was training teachers to teach and learn with an inquiring mind through technology, using a Zoom platform such as this, is that we need to get the kids engaged. We need to get the kids involved. And that's what teaching and learning with inquiring minds is all about. It's about how can we get the kids not only engaged, but also encourage them to be involved in the experience. So right now in the chat, I'm going to look here. I'm still seeing if there's people putting in there. Tell me something you would like me to address, because you're going to basically tell me what you want me to address as a part of this. And then what is something you want to take away? Because I'm going to give you a lot of information. I'm going to give you a lot of strategies today. And also, I'm going to ask you, what is one thing you learned today that you can take right after this webinar or tomorrow? So as I'm talking, what I'd like you to do is, again, just add into the chat, what is it that you would like me to address? And also, what would you like to take away from the training? Seeing some answers there. So how to coach my staff on using questioning to accomplish learning. Definitely going to be doing that today, Casey. Kelly says learning more how to deepen questions for students, ways to support engagement. We're going to totally do that today as well. Anyone else want to share? Okay. Terry almost says your objectives are very similar to mine. Good. I'd like to take away some skills. Oh, you're going to definitely get some skills. As a coach, I'd like to know how I can get teachers to understand how good questioning increases student success. Definitely. Because what if I told you today that the questions I'm going to teach you to phrase and pose, you can use them for assessment, but the true intent and purpose of them is to basically activate, advance, and augment student learning. Okay, we got some good input here. Now, before I get started, and before I start to wax philosophical about good questions and such, what I like to do is I like to try to get some feedback from my audience. I like to try to get some feedback from my students. This is how I used to teach. I could walk in a room and I just ask a question. So I'm going to ask you right now, please enter in the chat. What's a good question? Just enter in the chat. And I like you to look at that message there. Keep calm. There is no right or wrong answer. This is you expressing and sharing. You're telling me what you think a good question is. So right now, please enter in the chat. What's a good question? Okay, Jennifer said open-ended. Renee said a question has multiple solution paths. Good. A good question wants to elicits thinking. Excellent. A good question is one that makes you question after you already have the answer. Very good, Todd. How to transfer questioning for adult learners and via virtual learning. Good. Good question has multiple levers to the answer. Very good, Vernita. Stacy, I'm going to scroll a little bit. Got some good answers here. Good answers, good responses. A question is one that makes you think. Good question is one that's thought-provoking. Thank you, Gabby, Terry, Stacy. See how I'm trying to acknowledge you here also with this? Okay. I want you to know that everyone here, what you guys have responded, congratulations, you're all right. Now, if we had more of an extended conversation, or if we were basically in a way we can communicate with each other deeper, I would ask you this. You're right, but why? In fact, I want you to remember that question I'm asking right now. You're right, but why? Because that is the one thing you're going to be always asking to make sure that your students are learning with an inquiring mind. Because what if I told you one of the biggest reasons why we're asking questions is because we want the kids not only to comprehend, but also communicate the depth and extent of their learning. So you've given me some really good background. You've also basically told me, okay, this is where you're coming from. This is what you're bringing to the table. This is my pre-assessment. I'm actually pre-assessing you. I want to know what your perspective is on what is a good question. But what if I suggested saying, let's change that question? Let's change it from what is a good question, because that makes it sound like a value judgment. It's not so much what a good question is in terms of value. It's what a good question does. A good question stimulates different levels of thinking. Now, if I was with you right there, I would ask to you, what does that mean to you? What stands out for you and what are you not sure about? Because notice I said different levels of thinking. What am I inferring right now that basically all levels of thinking is what basically makes a question good? Yes. Questions that ask kids to recall and remember, they're good questions. Questions that only ask kids to understand. And I'm sorry saying understand because it's not only understand. That's a good question. If the child is thinking, it's a good question. Okay, that's one thing I want to get across. You can use good questions to check for and confirm knowledge, understanding, and awareness. We often use questions for that because what if I said primarily in school, we primarily use questions to assess learning. It's not like when children are between the age of 2 and 5. If you've been with a child between the age of 2 and 5, what's the question they always ask? Why? And we think it's because they're assessing us, they're testing us. But that's actually a school mentality because in school, why do we ask questions? Is it to activate and advance learning or is it to assess? Because that's really the way children and adults interact with each other. Question and answer. When kids between the age of 2 and 5, they're the ones who's asking all the questions and we have to go and get the answers. And sometimes we can't. When they come to school, now it's the adult who's asking the questions and the student has to answer. And that's why students sometimes stop asking questions because it's not about the question, it's about the answer. And you better be correct or incorrect or it's not good. What if I said that's why we sometimes have kids stop questioning in school? Because they're stressed about being wrong. And they're also stressed about being right. And they also feel that pressure. We need to make questions more comfortable. We need to have students understand that when we ask questions, especially good questions, we are actually expanding their knowledge and extending their thinking. We don't expect an answer. What if I said we use the question to basically go and tell the kids, this is what's going to be the instructional focus, and this is what initiates the inquiry. We ask good questions to pique curiosity, imagination, interest, and wonder. When I was in the classroom, one of my favorite things to do is just walk in the room and ask a question. I would ask something like, so how did Edgar Allan Poe create an entire genre of literary fiction? What if I told you he was the first to write a detective mystery story featuring a detective who used deductive logic and reasoning to solve a crime? And then I asked my kids, who does that sound like? And a lot of them would say Sherlock Holmes. And then I would say, what if I told you that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle actually based Sherlock Holmes on a character that Edgar Allan Poe created about 40, 50 years earlier named C. Auguste Dupin in The Murders in the Rue Morgue? And then I'd have my students read that story. Might not be in a textbook, but I would go up beyond the textbook with that. Or I'd have them find links where they can go and read the story for free, or I'd print it up for those kids who don't have the devices. And then I would ask them, how did Edgar Allan Poe create the common motif, style, and theme of detective mystery fiction with immersion room work? Now, this was an AP. This was in my mainstream class with the kids of all different levels. And they loved it because they could basically go and address that question that got them to read. So when you ask a question, you're not only assessing them, you're piquing their curiosity, imagination, interest, and wonder. My challenges to you is tomorrow, go in your class or have your teachers go in their class and just start the lesson with a question. The other thing a good question does is it encourages students to express and share their learning in their own unique way. We need to have our kids learn how to communicate the depth and extent of their learning. Answers come free, okay? I can go on Google and I can find every answer that's correct. Now ChatGPT or AI can explain it to me. But what we need to do is have the students be able to explain, to justify, to extend the depth and extent of their learning in their own unique way. That involves summarizing, that involves critiquing, that involves exploring. That's also why, because we want to hear the kids speak. We want to hear what exactly the kids know and how deeply they know and understand it. When I ask you a good question, again, I don't expect you to answer. I am basically prompting you to reflect before responding. Because if you can answer that question quickly, I'm going to show you how I basically continue the conversation in about 5 seconds, about 5 minutes probably. Finally, it phrases the instructional focus and purpose for learning as a question. A lot of times in education, we do two things. We present information and we provide instruction. We speak with declarative sentences and we teach with imperative sentences. Do this. What if we can flip that and turn it into a question that actually invites the student to learn? That's what I'm going to show you today. In fact, what if I actually showed you the first way to teach and learn with an inquiring mind right now? I call that hooking them. You hook them. I hooked you. I hooked you by saying, what's a good question? And that's how I initiated the experience. And you guys all wrote it in the chat and your answers are all right. You gave some great answers. This is the Inquiring Minds framework. This is a framework I developed to basically use to teach and learn through inquiry and by questioning with good questions. You start by hooking them with a question. Ask any question. They don't have to answer it. Just ask the question. Sets the instructional focus, initiates the inquiry. Then, based upon the demand of the standards and the strength of the students, you will guide them down one of 4 different pathways to inquiry. Now, this is not a taxonomy. It doesn't scaffold. We have enough taxonomies out there, okay? These are just the 4 different ways students can engage in and experience inquiry. So there's foundational inquiry, which focuses on just the facts. Now, a lot of times we ask those questions, but what if we could get the students to come up with the questions so they can acquire just the facts or understand how to just do it? What if I said we can put a stimulus up there like an image, or we can put a prompt up there like a statement, a standard, or a segment of text, have them read it and say, what is it that you don't know and understand? How could you phrase that to me as a question? And they create the vocabulary lists. They create the factual questions that they need to basically acquire the information for. Inquiry for understanding is standards-based. I'm going to show you today how you can turn your standards into questions. Because what if I told you that the question is actually sometimes hidden in the standard? Deep inquiry, that's what we all want to do. That's the creative inquiry that we get into. That's where we go be deep within the subject area. We go across the curriculum. We go beyond the standards, even beyond the classroom. We all want to do that, and we put extensive pressure on ourselves to ask those questions. What if I told you I'm going to teach you a simple way to do that? Because it's not easy asking questions. And it's not easy being a questioner. I see a few people out there that I know who are colleagues and friends, and thank you for being here today. And you guys know I ask questions. And you guys know sometimes it's not so much welcoming when I ask questions, but that's how I learn. And it's very, very hard to be a questioner. And it's very, very hard to be a learner who questions. So basically today, I'm going to show you a very easy way where you can go and stimulate your inquiring mind. Now, the next way is expertise. Now, what if I told you that's one of the most personal and complex questions our kids can address, and it'll be the easiest question we can ask? So this is the Inquiring Minds framework. If you have any questions as I go along with this, please feel free to enter in the chat. I'm monitoring the chat. I'm reading the chat as I present. And you know what, to tell you the truth, I don't want to be a talking head. I don't want to sit here and talk the whole time. Sometimes on virtual here, when we are in a situation like this, we do have to unfortunately talk. But I'd like to have some interaction. I'd like to respond to you, because teaching and learning with an inquiring mind is not about the teacher. It's about the student, and that's you. So let's go into what it means to hook them. Hooking them means you can just basically go into the class, start the lesson, and start it with asking a question. In fact, what if I told you most teachers are already doing this? It's called the bell work. I cannot tell you how many times I've walked into classrooms and observed classrooms, and I see an awesome question for the bell work. And I'm thinking, wow, that question could drive the whole lesson. That could even drive the whole period. And they spend 5 minutes on it because then they got to teach. That's not basically teaching, learning, the inquiring mind. You can hook them with a good question. And then from there, you can ask them 2 questions to get them going and to get them learning. And the 2 things you can ask them is this. When a student responds, you can basically say 2 things. What does he mean? And you're right, but why? What do you mean? And you're right, but why? And let me tell you about my own rethinking. That question, what do you mean? I used to say that all the time. Someone give me an answer. What do you mean? Someone give me a response. What do you mean? I realized that kind of put off some people. I realized some people felt maybe attacked, or maybe they felt uncomfortable. So I had to rethink my approach. So now what I actually say a lot of times is, you're right, but why? So I'm validating that they're right, but why? And now I use what do you mean if I want them to explain further, or I want them to clarify their answers. Because if they said to me, if I said, what is 5 plus 3? And they said 9, I'd say, what do you mean? Then they have to explain and say, well, when I have 5 and I have 3 and I combine it, oh, it's actually 8. So I'm using that now for more elaboration and to check for now, and also to have them check their own understanding. So let me show you how this works. Let's say I asked, what is 2 plus 2? Most of you probably would tell me 4. And then I'd say, you're right, but why? And traditionally, I mean, if you grew up in the 80s like I did, you would just care about the answer because it is. But that's not what modern learning is about. Modern learning is about how and why did you get that answer? And why is it accurate or inaccurate? Or what else can you do with it? Let me tell you a little bit of story about a child I was working with in Sierra Vista, Arizona, 1st grade. Comes up to me and he says, Mr. Francis, I know what 1,000 plus 1,000 is. And I said, okay, what is it? He said, 2,000. And I said, you're right, but why? And he said, because when I have 1 and 1 and combine them, I make 2. And I have 3 zeros to bring it down. Now I have 4 digits, so I know it's 1,000, so that's 2,000. So I decided to challenge him a little bit, and I said, okay, so what's 5,000 plus 7,000? He worked it out, and he said 12,000. And I said, you're right, but why? Because when I have 5 and 7 and I combine them, and I was using the language of math, because addition is combining, or putting together, or increasing. When I combine them, I get 12. But when I bring my 3 zeros down, now I have 5 digits, and I have 12,000. Now, before any presumptions are made saying, well, that child must be gifted, what if I told you that gifted kids struggle to do that? Gifted kids can tell you the answer. And gifted kids can make all these credible connections and extensions. That's what makes them gifted. They're divergent thinkers. They think divergently. That's why they're gifted. But what they struggle with is explaining and justifying their responses, their results, and their reasoning. And what if I told you that's true learning? It's not whether you can answer the math problem correctly. Can you explain how you attained that answer? Can you justify why it's accurate or inaccurate? Can you consider other options and possibilities? Because if you notice that 1st grader, you know what he did? He had his one problem. He gave me the answer and he explained why, and he was able to transfer the learning. What if I told you that's true learning? We're not teaching the kids how to answer questions or solve problems or complete tasks. We're trying to teach them how to explain and justify how and why they did it the way they did, and think about what else they could do with it, because that's true transfer of learning. If a child does that, what if I told you they could answer any question or solve any problem or complete any task you give them? So here's another example. Now, this is how I also handle contention. If I asked who was the first president of the United States, most people say George Washington. And I'd say, what do you mean? Now, you might be looking at me right now. I can't really see you that, but you're looking at me and I go, what do you mean? What do you mean? He was the first president of the United States. I say, well, you're right, but why? Because he was the first elected. Oh, okay. So now I can go and introduce about the fact that what if I told you there were actually 8 presidents of the United States, called 8 presidents of the United States in Congress assembled, appointed under the Articles of Confederation. Now, I love this too, because what if I told you it also gets me on debates with teachers, especially the history teachers, because the history teachers go, oh, you're going that route. What do you mean? Well, they weren't really presidents. You're right, but why? Because they had the title, but they didn't have the power. You're right, but why? Because the United States did not want a strong centralized government. You're right, but why? See what I'm doing there? I'm having them elaborate. I'm having them. It's not about me. It's about them. And I'm validating them because they are right. Because this is a big debate. And that actually leads into our argumentative question I used to ask the kids, which is, should we continue to credit George Washington as the first president of the United States? Or should we acknowledge the 8 presidents who came before him and were appointed under the Articles of Confederation? And if you're asking me, how does that tie to the standard? I would say this: the standard says, understand how the failures of the Articles of Confederation led to the writing of the United States Constitution. That was one of the failures. We didn't have a strong centralized government. We didn't have a president with executive power. I decided to emphasize that with my instructional focus, and I thought the kids would find that interesting. And how does it address the standard? Because I made an argumentative question. Should George Washington continue to be credited as the first president of the United States, or should we also acknowledge the 8 that were appointed before him under the Articles of Confederation? So that's a big thing. Anytime you ask a question, and if someone can give you the answer, ask one of 2 things. What do you mean, for clarification, and you're right, but why, for explanation and justification. Now, also, what you can do is you can encourage students to question answers. In fact, we want them. Again, we live in a time where basically answers come free. With a stroke of my keyboard, I can get answers. I don't know if they're accurate or inaccurate, but I can get answers. So an example is this. If I said to you, what is 542 times 398? And then I just gave you the answer, 215,716. I knew that because I have a calculator. In fact, it's really funny because when I'm in presentations and I go, what's 542 times 398? And people are kind of thinking and working out in pencil. I go, it's 215,716. Don't be impressed because I have a calculator. Okay. But then I ask, you're right, but why? Now I see, and I'm checking whether to really understand the concept of multiplication. And maybe they have a special way that they do multiplication. Maybe they do the traditional way, stacking products, stacking factors, get your partial products, and add. In my old age, I'm starting to do place value understanding. 542 times 300 plus 542 times 90 plus 542 times 8. Drop my zeros to make a triple digit times a single digit, bring back my zeros, partial product, get my answer. And I could solve any multiplication problem correctly or successfully because I can explain how I did it. Or maybe they do arrays, or maybe they use the Windows method, or maybe they use lattice because that's the way they understand. Maybe they know how to use the stick method that came out of Asia. I can't teach that, but maybe there's a video out there that I can explain it to them. And I'd ask, do you understand that? Yes, good, because I don't understand it, so you're going to have to explain it to me. See, again, that communication. Or how about this? How many planets are in the solar system? Now, we're being taught that there's 8. And some people are really stuck on 9. But are there 8 planets or are there 9 planets? And what's the story behind it? That's the thing. We need to start asking, why do we do this? And the answer can't be because that's the way it's always been done. So are there 8 planets or are there 9 planets? Well, what the kids will learn is that there's 8 planets because popular vote at an assembly of scientists said there's 8 planets. But the Harvard-Smithsonian debate that they had in 2000, around the late 2010s, they said, actually the late 2000s, excuse me, they said it's subjective to the era in which the planets were identified. So that's a great debate right there. And again, you're right, but why? Are there 8 or are there 9? Is it based upon when we were taught and told that? How about this? Who's the main character in The Great Gatsby? Now, I have my perspective and thoughts as a teacher, but I also Googled it and I went on ChatGPT. Some of the sites said to me, Jay Gatsby, and some of the sites said to me, Nick Carraway. So is it Gatsby or Nick? The kids have to tell me why they're right and why. And they're engaging in argumentation. So again, hook them with the question. And then if they give you an answer, ask them, you're right, but why? That will always have them communicating their learning. And also it will have them demonstrate and communicate their learning, comprehend and communicate their learning at a deeper DOK level. We're going to talk about that in a second, depth of knowledge DOK. Okay. Now, what if they can't answer the question, or what if they don't answer the question? Because how many of you guys have been in a situation where you've asked a question and the kids don't talk? Or how many times you've been in a situation where you feel like you're talking too much? That's where I say this technique, talk amongst yourselves. If my students are not responding to my questions, I have them talk amongst themselves. I give them that time to reflect before responding. And I may throw out another question. And if they still don't respond, okay, talk amongst yourselves. And that's this process. You pose the question that informs the instruction, initiates the inquiry. So if I said, basically, how did Edgar Allan Poe create an entire genre of literary fiction? Or how does The Outsiders address the idea of family? Or how could we create football plays using linear equations? Or what do you think would happen if an earthquake hit this location? Okay, talk amongst yourselves. What do you guys think about that? Provide time to reflect before responding, and you can ask another question. That's why it's a fishing rod with hooking them. You're not deep sea fishing, you're fly fishing. You throw it out, bring it back. Throw it out, bring it back. If no one's biting, talk amongst yourselves. Let them talk amongst themselves. Bring it back in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And then you ask, who would like to share what someone told you? Why do I ask that question? Because what if I said, number one, when somebody shares in a group talk or a pair, it's usually the person who did most of the talking and they're sharing what they think, and the other people are just sitting there nodding their heads. Or the other thing is, what if I also told you I'm teaching them how to summarize what they've listened and what they've heard? And then the other person can say, yeah, that's what I said, or that's not what I said. So you're teaching them how to listen, comprehension and communication skills, which is also a standard. And then you ask, very, very, very important, ask them, who would you like to hear from and learn from next? Have them choose the next person. Have them go and pick the next person in class and hear from them. What did someone tell them? What did they learn? What did they take away from this? You turn it over to the students, and they're the ones who are basically choosing the next person to whom they want to listen and learn. What if I told you this takes away the stress of being called on, and it also gets the kids engaged and involved because they're wondering, oh my gosh, is that person going to call on me? Now I'm going to give you some real devil's advocate here. So some people say, well, what if that feels like it's picking on people? Well, that's why you have to control your classroom and make sure that basically you've created an environment where all answers are respected and welcome, even if they're not right or wrong or correct or incorrect. The other thing is I get is, well, what if they pick all their friends? Well, number one, if that's who they want to listen and learn from, that's fine. And number two, they might not be their friends much longer. So that's a joke. So the thing is that you turn it over to them and you have them pick and choose who they want to listen to and learn from next. And then you ask, does anyone else want to contribute? And then what happens is people start talking more. Okay. That's the true thing about teaching, learning, acquiring mind. The less you teach, the less you talk, the more engaged the kids will be through inquiry and by questioning. So that's the next strategy. So let's talk about those good questions that promote inquiry. There's 3 things a question should do. It should provide the student opportunity to share their voice, to give them choice, and take action. We want the students to be able to have a voice in their responses. We want them to be able to choose how they want to respond. And then we also want them to take action in what they do. What does that look like? That looks like this. This is a typical standards referenced worksheet. You have the standard up there, multiply multi-digit numbers fluent using an algorithm, and you probably will have the kids basically complete those 20 questions. What I do actually is that there's 25 questions. Sorry about that. what I recommend, and what if I said this? What if you turn that standard to a question that says, how could you multiply multi-digit numbers fluently using an algorithm? What if I said that this is going to basically take a whole week? Because this is going to be your formative and the summative assessments. You start it on Monday by posing that question. It's after you've taught the concept and they've learned it, different ways to do it. Then the whole week, Monday, you ask the kids, pick 5 up there and answer that question. So day 1, they may pick this 5. Day 2, they may pick this 5. Day 3, they may pick this 5. Day 4, they may pick this 5. And the last 5 they don't pick, that's their test. What if I said this is a way for kids to choose what they want to use for their test? Now, I can sometimes get also devil's advocate again. Well, what if they pick all the hard ones first? Great. What'd they get away with? An education? They got it out of the way. Okay. It's not about the grade. It's about the learning. That's something that transformed me as a teacher. What if I told you the minute I stopped caring about the kids' grades and I cared about their learning, they learned and they felt more comfortable. So basically, that's how I would assess. I would take that one question, I would give all those math items. I'd say, here it is. Pick the 5 you want today. Use that to answer your question. Pick the 5 the next day, answer that question. Pick the 5 the next day, answer that question. Pick another 5, answer that question. Last 5 you don't pick, that's your test. That's the summative. So that's another strategy, basically, how you give them voice, choice, and action. That's huge. That's what a good question does. But here's the thing when it comes to these questions. Let me ask you this. Is this a good question? Give me your response in the chat. Do you think this is a good question? It's a typical kind of things we get for questions. But what you've learned about teaching and learning with inquiring mind, do you think this is a good question? Catherine, I'll put the math thing back. So basically it would go like this, Catherine. That basically what you would do is you turn your stand to a question, which I'm going to teach you guys that in a bit, and then you have them pick which items they want to address every day and let them choose which items will serve as their test. You're testing them on that question. You're assessing that question. The math problems are actually examples that will support their responses. So if you said no, right. And I like that someone saying DOK one quick answer. That's right. What's the correct answer? C. Because that's what they gave me. That's actually a question I dissuade people. Don't ask what's the theme of The Outsiders, or don't ask what's the theme. Okay? Basically, and you ask that question, it's not a subjective question, it's an objective question. I can say to you, do you want what I think, what you taught me, or what this book is saying? Because there is no correct or incorrect answer. Because the true thing is, this is actually what the question is asking. What is the theme of The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton? It's all these things. It could be any one of those things. And when you ask, what's the central idea and theme by The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton, you're actually not asking them to answer correctly. You're asking them to justify which they think is the central idea and theme. See? Multiple choice items are not questions. They're activities, items, and tasks students can complete. Sometimes they're phrased as questions or interrogative statements, but they're not a question. They also don't address the standards. Here are the different standards that are basically being addressed and assessed throughout the nation. Now, most of us are still Common Core in some sort of form, but look what that says. Determine a theme, a story, or essential idea of a text and analyze its development over the course of the text. That question didn't do the second part there. It's not even asking them to determine the theme of a central idea or text. It's asking them, did you get it correctly or incorrectly? Look at the teaks there. Infer multiple themes within a cross text using text evidence. So again, there could be more than one theme. So yeah, Stacy, I always say, what's the central idea and theme of the story? Do you want what I think, what you taught me, or what this book says? And that's actually from a personal story, because when I was in high school, my teacher asked me, what's the theme of Romeo and Juliet? And I thought I was too young to fall in love, because at the time I was really glommed onto the fact that they were 14, 13 years old. And also I was going through my own Romeo and Juliet drama at the time. It was ninth grade. And also there was a song on the radio by Motley Crue called Too Young to Fall in Love. So I said, that's the central message and central theme. And I defended and justified it. And my teacher gave me an F because that's not what I taught you. Okay. That's the thing. It's not so much can they answer correctly when we answer that. It's can they defend and justify their response. So again, look at Indiana's standards there. Analyze the development of a theme or central idea over the course of a work or of literature. Or the best standard in Florida, compare 2 or more themes and their development through a literary text. You got to make sure that the item you're giving them addresses and assesses the standard either fully, which is the whole standard, acceptably, which is part of the standard, or sometimes it'll be insufficiently, which is maybe, okay, you're talking about theme, but did you teach them how to determine a theme of a story from details in a text and analyze the development over the course of a text? That's why you got to be careful of that. Teaching and learning with an inquiring mind would do this. These are all the themes or ideas that are addressed in The Outsiders. I'd give it to the kids. And I'd say, okay, we're reading chapter 2. It addresses this idea. How does The Outsiders by S.E. Hinton address the following themes? Now you're having the kids really achieve that standard. That basically you're saying it addresses this theme this way. They're actually making the thematic statement, and they'll give you examples and evidence from the text, which makes it DOK 2 or 3. You could also ask them, which do you think is the central message of the theme of The Outsiders and why? And you better be prepared for what they might say, and you may disagree with them. But it's not whether they're correct or incorrect. It's whether they can justify or verify with evidence. See the difference? What if I told you that will actually get the kids to be assessed authentically? I like to say multiple choice questions are like pitches in baseball. You're either going to be able to hit the pitch or not based upon the quality of the pitch thrown at you or how you feel on that day. But what is true learning? Communication. What is true measure of learning? Not just can I do it, but can I explain how I did it? Can I justify why I did it that way? And can I explore and extend what else can I do with it? And this is a big thing to know about good questions. The rigor is in the response. When you want to judge the rigor of a question, it depends upon what exactly and how deeply the students have to comprehend and communicate their depth of knowledge. Now, there's a lot of information about DOK out there, and that's actually my other wheelhouse, and I wrote a book about it. And what I said is to determine the DOK level, you need to consider what exactly and how deeply they have to comprehend and communicate their learning. So at a DOK 1, they only have to answer correctly or incorrectly. Now, math teachers sometimes have a hard time with this because they go, well, that was a hard problem. Right, but if I just have to plug in an algorithm or use a formula or follow rules and steps, that's a DOK 1. At a DOK 2, you have to explain or express with examples. That's where you get into going from what is 2 plus 2, 4, you're right, but why? That is going into basically explaining how they attain that answer or expressing their opinions about the answer. At a DOK 3, which is actually the most complex, because there's so many things going on, you have to either justify or verify an answer with evidence, which means that I can give the kids an answer and ask them, why is it correct or incorrect? Or they have to conclude, consider, critique based upon evidence. That's when I give them hypothetical questions like, what if? Or I give them argumentative questions saying, is it this or that? That's a DOK 3. And if you want to do a DOK 3 every single time, because I know DOK is making a comeback, and I know it's having more emphasis again, if you want to do a DOK 3 every single time, give the kids the answer and ask them why is it correct or incorrect. It doesn't have to be correct. It can be incorrect. Or ask them, what if? That's a DOK 3. And a DOK 4, they have to explore and extend an answer with examples and evidence. This is where you're going deep within a subject area. This is when you're going across the curriculum. You're going through multiple texts or connecting and comparing multiple topics. Okay? So the rigor of your questions is not how hard it is. It's what exactly and how deeply the kids have to respond. Do they have to just answer? Could be hard. 542 times 398, that's hard. But if I ask them to do, say, 215,716, it's a DOK 1. Okay? Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals c squared. That means that basically I know to use that to find out whether it's a right triangle. That's a DOK 1. Okay? If I basically have to tell you what is green eggs and ham or The Outsiders or Pride and Prejudice, varies in difficulty, but if I just have to tell you what it's about, it's a DOK 1. Okay. DOK 2, you're right, but why? Now the student is summarizing and paraphrasing. That's the true learning. And when I work with schools with depth of knowledge, you know what I say to them first? I say this, you know what? Let's just start having the kids understand and use their learning at DOK 2. But the standard demands this. You're right. Standard demands this, but we're measuring their learning. Can they explain how they got their answers? And then maybe talk about, can they justify it? Because then that gets into a DOK 3. Simplest thing with DOK 3 is you got to prove whether it's accurate and inaccurate. One of my favorite is I ask, can 2 + 2 = 5? And everyone says no. And I say, you're right, but why? Because 2 + 2 = 4. You're right, but why? Because when I have 2 and 2, put them together, 4. What would I need to do to make it 5? Add 1 more. Great, you understand addition. But what if you use addition, decimals, and rounding? Could 2 + 2 = 5? Now, for the first time in the last month, somebody said yes, and I said, you're right, but why? And they said, because when I have 2.8 and 2.2 and add them, I get 5. And what's interesting is that I say, wait a minute, I said 2 + 2 = 5. You just made 3 + 2, because when I round 2.8 up, it's a 3. So now they got to think a little strategically about that. And DOK 4, explore and extend. And I want to basically tell you right now, you don't have to do a DOK 4 unless the standard demands it. Okay? Pressure off everybody. You don't have to do a DOK 4 unless the standard demands it. That's good teaching, going beyond the standard. You want to go beyond the standard, you want to give that experience, that makes you a good teacher, but don't basically critique and judge your teaching because you didn't get to a DOK 4. You need to get the kids to the standard and through the standard and beyond the standard. You don't have to go to a DOK 4. I just want to put that out there right now. That's just good teaching. Okay. So let's take that statement you did. Remember that statement I said, what's essential to learn, important to understand, or nice to know? Right now, I want you to take that statement and I want you to put a few words in front of it. Actually, 5 words in front of it. What if I told you? That will morph your instruction to inquiry. Do you notice sometimes through this seminar, through this webinar, I'm saying, what if I told you? I could do that in lecture because that's all lecture right there. But look how it transforms when I say, what if I told you? What if I told you there were 8 presidents of the United States in Congress assembled appointing the Articles of Confederation? Did I invite you into the learning? What if I told you that electric and magnetic forces, electromagnetic, can be attractive or repulsive? What if I told you a fractions of division problem? What if I told you a Shakespeare and tragic hero is a respected person who has a flaw or downfall that makes a critical mistake and leads to their downfall? That's what I'm doing when I say, what if I told you? So instead of lecturing, instead of saying this, because I'll tell you right now, I'm lecturing a lot. But when I say, what if I told you, I'm inviting you in. So how do you do this? Right now, I want you to type in, copy and paste right now into the chat. You made that statement, what's essential to learn, what's important to understand, what's nice to know. When I work with schools, what I do is I have them write on the front of the card, on the line part of the card, what's essential to learn, important to understand, nice to know. And on the back, I have them write, what if I told you? And then I have them go around the room and I have them share, what if I told you? And I ask them to watch people's reactions. So right now, you wrote it down in your basically in your Word document there. Put what if I told you in front of your statement. Enter it into the chat. Share. Make us all look at it and go, wow, I want to learn that. Just put what if I told you in front of that statement. So what you do is you just identify what you want to lecture. And then you say, you write it down to train your mind on an index card on the front part with the lines. And on the back part, you say, what if I told you? And then basically you present it like that. That's that technique. So what if I told you that if you do this, it will really change the tone of how instruction is experienced in your room and how your kids respond, because you're stimulating their thinking. Now, I could have told you if you do this, you'll stimulate the kids' thinking. That's a direct statement. But what if I told you invites you? And then if the kids don't respond, talk amongst yourselves. What do you think about that? Here's another thing that's really good in terms of literacy process. Okay. Very good, Stacy. What if I told you knowing misconceptions that students might have about a skill is important to understand about a subject or skill you teach? You got me wanting to learn that. That's awesome, Stacy. Thank you for contributing. This is something I'm doing to help kids understand text. And actually, I'm doing this with adults. First, I have them read it fluently, and then I have them review what it's saying and then reflect and respond. And the way it works is this: you present them a prompt or a stimulus. It can be a statement, it can be a visual. And you ask them, what is it telling you? What does it mean to you? What stands out for you? And what are you not sure about? So they read it, they reflect on it, they talk amongst themselves with it. And then when you bring them back, the first thing you say is, what stands out for you? Start with the positive. What do you see? What do you notice? Okay, what does that mean to you? It means this. So what is it telling you? Now they're learning how to infer, because our kids get stuff like this and they could read it fluently. Adults could read this fluently. So if I said to you, what is this telling you about a ratio? You can read it fluently. But then I ask you, what does it mean to you? What stands out for you in those statements? And what are you not sure about? And then when I bring it back, I'd say, okay, so what stands out for you? So you might be saying there that what stands out is it's a comparison of quantities of the same units. Well, what does that mean to you? Well, it means like it's part of a whole. Okay, well, what does that sound like? A fraction. So what if I told you a ratio is actually a fraction? Because a fraction is a decimal, a fraction is a percentage, it's also a ratio. Well, blow my mind. What I teach you? Absolutely nothing. I just asked you a question. And then you ask them, what does it mean to you? What is it telling you? And then you ask them what it's not sure about. So tomorrow, try that. Put it up on the board, have the kids read it, and then read it fluently. Say, read it fluently, or you can read out loud, and then ask, okay, you just read that fluently. Great, DOK1. What is that telling you? What does it mean to you? What stands out for you, and what are you not sure about? Have them write it down, have them talk it out, and then bring them back and say, okay, so what stands out for you in that? What does that mean to you? So what is it telling you? Is there anything still you're not sharing about? That's how you use inquiry and guided for instruction for reading. Now here's a very big important part. Remember that standard I told you to find? With standards, what if I told you that basically you can turn any standard into a question, and you can create a question that actually will be an authentic measure of their learning? Not all these items and not all these questions, not all these, multiple choice or problems or tasks. That's the question. Because these are not good questions. Even though there's a question stem in it, if you talk to our kids like that, we sound like a drill sergeant. There's 3 question stems you can put in front of your standard. The first is, how do you? That will be used for assessment. So right now, with that standard you pick, put how do you in front of that objective. Or you got a learning target, replace I can with how do you. Now you have an assessment question. You can use this for assessment. The second question stem is, how can you? And that sets the instructional focus. So when I put how can you in front of that standard, now I'm asking them and inviting them into the instruction. And in fact, what if I suggested tomorrow that instead of doing learning targets where it says I can, because you're directing, you're putting words in the kid's mouth, I can. In fact, there's also research out there where that's actually leading kids to go, no, I can't. And actually the person who came up with the concept said, change that introduction, because what if I told you that the kids are saying that? What if instead of saying I can, you say, how can you? The third one, and this is my favorite, and I didn't want to lead with it because I didn't want to control your thinking, is how could you? Because with how could you, now you're engaging them in inquiry. So what if instead of a learning target that says I can, you said, how could you? Try it tomorrow. You got learning targets on your board? Just erase the I can and say, how could you? And if the kids can't respond to that, or they say, I don't know, what is it you don't know? What is this telling you? What does it mean to you? What stands out for you? What are you not sure about? Or if they're silent, talk amongst yourselves. Because this will shift you from being a drill sergeant to inviting the kids into learning. When I say I can, I'm putting words in their mouth. I can. It's supposed to be self-esteem, but do they believe that? When I use just objectives and say this, or the student will, I sound like a drill sergeant. But if I said, how do you? That allows me to go and show you how I can do it. How can you gets me reflecting, and how could you really gets me, stimulates my thinking. Now, the other thing, this is also how you create your inquiry for expertise questions. Anytime you say you in your question, and I'd suggest don't say, how could we? Because when you say, how could we, you're not individualizing that student. You're not recognizing that student. When you say you, it's collective and it's individualized. If I said, how could I'd be in your class and I'd be saying, I don't know, teacher, how could you? Okay. Don't give the kids the question that let them reflect. Ask them, how could you, collectively, individually? Now, here's the other thing to look out for standards. Remember those question stems? If you just remove the Bloom's verb, you have your question. See how that worked? I found my question stem and I just remove the Bloom's verb, or I move it. Because now I'm asking the kids, how do particular elements of a story or drama interact? How does setting shape the plot? How does setting shape the characters? Instead of saying explain why, I'm asking, why do the following addition and subtraction strategies work? Look for the question stem in the standard and then move or remove the verb, and you'll have a standards-based question. Not standards reference, like a lot of items are, standards-based, because the standard actually becomes the question. Another thing to do with this, and this is for inquiry for understanding, another thing is, and I talk about this in my book, Bloom's taxonomy, many people use this to come up with their questions. But what if I told you Benjamin Bloom actually wasn't the one who said my questions are for this? It was actually this person, Nora Sanders, in this book called Classroom Questions, What Kind? Came out in like 1966. He said, hey, Bloom's taxonomy is great, but use it sparingly. So Benjamin Bloom says, this is my taxonomy is for objectives, not questions. The question comes from the teacher. So in my book, Inquiring Minds Want to Learn, what I did was I flipped Bloom's into an inverted pyramid. And instead of verbs, I replaced all the verbs with question stems. So whenever you see a Bloom's verb, find out where it's categorized. And this is the question stem you would use. And I also put into it, because a lot of people didn't know, what if I told you there's actually an SEL Bloom's taxonomy? You know how we say Maslow before Bloom's? Well, actually, there's Maslow with Bloom's, because the affective domain is how we process our learning, how we feel about our learning. And this is the affective domain of Bloom's taxonomy. Not many people know about this. And these are the question stems that you can use to get the kids to personally and emotionally invest in their learning. So that's also in the book. Now, where could good questions come from? And I'm going to close this. Here's the thing. We put too much pressure on ourselves to come up with good questions. For me to say to you, you need to ask better questions or good questions, that's like me saying to you, you need to go paint the Sistine Chapel on the ceiling of your classroom, or here's this guitar, I want you to play like Eddie Van Halen. Questioning is a gift. It's a blessing and a curse, because you got to be able to not only think critically, but you got to think creatively. And you got to be a curious person to ask questions. But also, you have to have the courage to question. You also have to have the confidence to ask the question, but also the confidence that what to do if nobody answers. And you also have to care about what you're asking. If you don't care about what you're asking, the kids will pick up on it. You have to really care. My kids knew, and people know when I ask a question, I care to know. It's not because I want the answer. It's like, I want to learn. So those are the three elements about personalizing how you individually do it. You got to be a curious person. You got to think critically about what you're asking and why you're asking it. You got to think creatively about how to ask it. And then you got to use courage and confidence. But if you use AI and Google, here's the question stem that you basically will put in there. What are good questions students could inquire, investigate through a deep inquiry into, and just name the subject or skill or technique or topic. These quickly are examples of what I've entered into ChatGPT. What are good questions students could inquire, investigate through a deep inquiry into the President of the United States appointed on Earth's Confederation? There's your questions. How did Edgar Allan Poe's writing style about Edgar Allan Poe? These are these questions. Here's fractions. It's as simple as this. It's not ChatGPT that will give it to you. It's how you use ChatGPT that will help you, or AI. And remember I asked this question? This is how actually another technique, because what I really was asking you was this: what do you need to learn? And what would you like to learn? That's why I used to ask my kids all the time. I would bring something up. I'd say, okay, so here's this thing. What do you need to know and understand? Or what is it that you don't know and understand? How would you phrase it to me as a question? And once we've learned it, I say, what do you want to learn about this? So these are the rules for what a good question does. You can use this as a checklist. And these are the 15 ways you can use questioning and inquiry to teach and learn with inquiring mind. I want to thank you all for being here today. And if anyone has any questions, anyone wants to put in the chat, I know I said a lot and I talked a lot. Way lecture, that's not teaching and learning with inquiring mind. But if anyone has any questions, this is the time to ask.
Thank you so much, Eric. This presentation was so great. It's very engaging. And it also brings me into thinking from my own profession as an interviewer and being more thorough and more thought provoking and also more intentional. So, this is so great. Thank you so much. Thank you, everybody who has been here with us, and we appreciate your time as well. Do want to give you a quick reminder here. As he has mentioned the book, we do want to encourage you to navigate to solutiontree.com/inquiring minds. And then also, as it mentions here, you can bring Eric and Francis to your school or connect virtually. If you want to request his availability, just navigate to solutiontree.com/Eric Francis. And I'll go ahead and place that in here as well. Again, if you do have any questions, you can email the email that is set up for AASA. Or as Eric mentioned, you can probably contact him directly. If you could put up your contact slide there. I think it was like the last one.
Actually, it's interesting as well. If you scan that QR code up there, everyone point your phone at that QR code. See where it says that next to Rethink and Relearn? If you scan that QR code and provide the information, it goes right to my phone. And also it allows us to maintain communication with each other. It also allows you to download slides. The other thing is I also have the ability to give you some recertification hours if you provide some of your email and contact information. So I'll be giving you 2 recertification hours through my micro-credentialing platform for being here today. That's my thanks for you being here and taking the time to learn with me.
Wonderful. We'll let everybody go. Thank you so much, ASA. And obviously, thank you so much, Eric. You're incredible. You know how I feel about your presentations, and it's so dynamic. And also, you're so wonderful to all of us with your knowledge. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And thank you for everyone being here. Thank you with learning with me. Thank you, Solution Tree, for supporting me as one of your authors. And ASA, thank you for having me present to your audience and constituents. And let's hope we can continue the conversations. Thank you, everyone.